Hi, everybody. Welcome. Glad to have you here, either in person, online. For those of you who are on Zoom, I'm just going to ask you to go ahead and mute yourself for now. And if you have any questions, I want to point out there is the chat feature on the bottom of the Zoom screen. So if you want to send in a question, or if you have a question at any time and you can feel free to unmute yourself and just ask. You can interrupt me. It's okay, I promise. This is being recorded. It will be posted on YouTube, so that way folks who can't join us today can find it in a future session. So we're going to go through all of that. Any questions before we get started? Okay. Hearing none, I'm gonna move us through. So the first piece that I wanted to sort of talk about is focusing on writing, just in general. So when you write, what are the things that get you stuck? So when you feel like you're approaching a paper or you're having to sort of open up a Word document and start writing into an assignment, are there particular things that you feel stuck about, or what might sort of make you feel stuck, Janessa?
I want to like say things a certain way. Like, I know what I'm thinking, but like to writtenly or communicate it, it's like harder. I want it to be like perfect.
Sure. So there's a couple of things. Like one, figuring out how to articulate what you really want to say. But two, there's also a judgment about the writing, right? That you want it to be perfect, and that sometimes maybe that desire to be perfectionistic tends to maybe have you have cursor paralysis, is what I like to call it, right? Like when the blinking sort of like cursor in Word makes you really sort of like, I don't know what to say, and so it stops you, right? Any other thoughts about what are things that get you stuck? Yeah.
I feel like too that I feel like when you're learning how to write essays and stuff, they always need a hook. You need something big. You need to draw people's interest, or else no one's gonna want to read it.
Sure.
So I kind of find myself bouncing around that. Am I opening this correctly?
Sure.
Are people even gonna care about what I have to say?
Yeah. Yeah. So again, for the folks online, thinking Lydia, correct? Right. So Lydia's sort of naming, like, we're taught that we have to like have a hook to our writing, right? And that we want our opening to be really solid. And so then sometimes that can be a thing that stops us at the front, because we feel like we have to sort of like, how can we sort of like reiterate what we really want to say in the most important piece, right? So that can sometimes get us stuck. So when we think about, thank you for those of you who sort of shared, what are some things that you've done to produce your best work as a writer? So what are some of the things that you might have taken advantage of? Yes.
So I like to do a little bit before I start writing.
Sure.
I'm very related to that topic.
Yep.
That's one that always helps me.
Good. So doing some reading before you get into the writing, so that can be helpful just in a couple of ways, right? So one, you start to sort of figure out what's your tack of what you want to say. Two, it also gives you an exemplar of sometimes like good writing can inspire you to also give a format or sometimes a formula in terms of how to sort of articulate your ideas as well. But also it can just help sort of make some connections, right? So if you're reading a couple of different articles, thinking about what is this person saying and how does that connect to what this article is saying, and what are the differences? What are the similarities? Is there a connection that I can sort of see as like a theme to sort of bring these things together, right? And that can help with writing. Other things that you might have done is in terms of producing your best writing. Yeah.
I do a lot of drafts.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to have it printed, and then I write with like a colored pen.
Sure.
That's how I pick out like, oh, this is a period, or I misspelled this.
Absolutely.
I make some typos, and then I'm like, oh, I have an idea, and then I'll write out the idea.
Great.
Then I'll type it back in.
Yeah.
Do multiple online and printed drafts.
Great. So what's being offered, right, is different drafts of your work, right? So printing them off, using some color coding potentially and going through and doing some peer editing, then going back to the paper on Word, typing those things in, making sure that you've made the corrections. Again, sometimes on the screen, our eyes get tired. We start to sort of lose our sort of focus, and then also taking a break, right? And going back to those drafts so that way you have some time away to have better perspective, because sometimes when we're in it and we're trying to like see all of it, we sort of lose the forest through the trees, right? So having to sort of do that can be really important. Any other things that you might have done to produce your best work as a writer? Yeah, Janessa.
Let other people see it.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Yes, it's so hard to let go of your work and to ask other people to take a look at it, right? It sometimes can feel very vulnerable for us because I like to say, you know, like my writing is sort of like my baby. I'm not going to have kids. And so my work and my writing feels very intimate. Like it's something that I've tried to construct an idea or an argument or a rationale for something. And then to give it to somebody else, asking them to be a critical friend and to sort of tear it apart in a nice way, in a constructive way, can feel sort of like jarring when you get it back and it's all marked up and there's lots of notes and suggestions. But it does oftentimes help us have a stronger sort of, help us build a stronger argument or a stronger rationale. And so doing that peer editing can be really, really important, right? So these are great suggestions. We're going to go through more of them, but I wanted us to at least start from a place of some self-reflection, thinking about these pieces. And hopefully by the time we leave today, or whenever you watch this video, if you're watching it in the future, then you have some ideas in terms of different strategies in terms of working on your academic writing, right? So I'm going to move us to the next. So when we talk about a thesis statement, that's oftentimes a primary piece of our writing. And so when we say that, what does that mean? What's a thesis statement? Any takers? Yeah.
It's like our argument with
Yeah.
points that we want to cover through our paper.
Great. So yeah, your thesis statement is, what is your main argument, right? What are the main arguments that you're trying to make in your paper? And what are the different points that we're going to address, right? So that becomes really, really critical, particularly with research papers and other assignments where you're drawing on research, that you have a very strong thesis statement. And that thesis statement should be in your introduction section of your paper. Even when you're writing a reflection paper though, not necessarily like a journal entry for 581, right? Like don't get crazy, don't get twisted. But like when you're writing a reflection paper for an assignment, you do have a thesis statement still there, right? So like when an instructor is asking you to critically self-reflect on a significant experience that you might have out in the field or in a leadership role or something like that, you're still having a thesis statement of like what you think is important and how you contextualize what that is within the paper and what your main argument is. So I also want to encourage folks to think about your thesis statement should always be like, what is the main argument that I'm trying to make in this assignment? It could be as simple as what the prompt is for the paper, right? With a little bit more detail about how that applies to you, but that is your thesis statement. And moving to the second question here, how do you keep reinforcing your thesis statement throughout your paper? The one thing that I would encourage you to think about is, think about your introduction as sort of the overview of your thesis statement. And then there may be some sub-themes of the thesis statement that need to be hit based upon specific experiences or specific concepts. And so if you then break down each of the following subsections, that sort of is highlighting a way to organize how your thesis statement then connects with all of the subsequent paragraphs or sections within your paper. And then your thesis statement should also appear again in your conclusion to talk about how you have addressed throughout the previous part of the paper your main argument and the main purpose of your work. So it's a way to sort of like tidy up and bookend, but then also really help with the organization of what you're trying to outline. So one of the things that I want to sort of talk about is through the supplemental material. So each of you hopefully has, each of you here, those of you who are online, I had sent an email to you just a little bit ago with a sample APA paper. So this is where I'm gonna refer to this, just have us take a look at it. So I want you to turn to page 2 at the top, and I have a paragraph here, right? The paper is talking about strengthening your scholarly voice. And so I want you to take a look and at the first paragraph, and I want you to just try to identify what is my thesis statement in this paragraph. Taking a look at that, where do you see a potential thesis statement? Okay, any ideas about the thesis statement in the opening? Sure, let's try it.
Because I'm like the in this paper till the end can be a really strong one, but cut into 2.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to focus on like a small snippet of like BAM's what I'm talking about. It's from like in particular to the end.
Okay, so any other thoughts?
From what I read in the paragraph, I'm thinking that even though the undergrad have had research with writing,
Mm-hmm.
but that needs strength and adapting
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
for your graduate.
Okay.
So I guess strength, adapting.
So adapting, the piece about adapting is potentially the piece about the section, what is that? The third sentence in this paper, I outline the major writing skills that students should develop for graduate level writing. In particular, I focus on students' command of their discipline's formatting style, address common errors, and highlight slight adjustments in students' grammar and syntax can produce helpful outcomes, right? So yeah, so essentially the thesis statement here, a thesis statement doesn't have to just be one sentence, right? But overall, the thesis argument that's being made is graduate student writing is a transition from undergrad to grad, right? There's different expectations, and there are some sub sort of arguments being made, and these are particularly in particular ... sentence, right? So that's sort of the main frame of the larger argument that's being made in this particular paper. And then, right, if we look through the paper, just like skimming it, right, we can see like, oh, like, okay, so up front in the introduction, it's named, these are the different component parts. And then we're talking about that. So you can see with the headings, major writing skills, understanding APA style, right? So some of the things that have sort of been named in the introduction that will be covered are then showing up subsequently in the different sections that are highlighted, right? So what I like to say is to folks, especially folks like yourselves who are like moving into grad level writing, every introduction needs a roadmap, right? So what I think is a roadmap is the statements of, in this paper, I will outline ... right? So part of what you're trying to do in a good introduction is to help the reader understand how you've organized your paper and your thoughts, and then subsequently then that helps you organize how the work is going to fall out in the rest of your paper, right? So that way, if you've named 3 things, then I'm going to expect as the reader, those 3 things are coming next. And each of the sections, it might be labeled, and then it's going to break it down that way, right? For those of you who might outline your papers, this is really helpful because ultimately your outline is already embedded in how you're actually like structuring your introduction and then sort of building it out. For those of you who don't necessarily like an outline, well, here's a model, right? So you don't have to outline, but it at least will give you a framing of how you might need to sort of think about like a linear process of organizing your work and framing it out in that way. Does that make sense? Okay. I think I'm going to mute. Okay, so recipe for writing, right? Every single paper, again, going back to even a reflection paper. And I would actually say, even for your journals for 581, right? Like you can have an introduction, you then have to expand and justify sort of what you're sort of talking about or elaborating on, and then a conclusion, right? So even in a journal reflection, you could still talk about, like, the prompt here was blah, 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 blah. Here's how I'm going to sort of talk about it. And then you go into the discussion, you go into the description, you expand on it. And then you have a conclusion sentence at the very least, but typically in a paper, right, a conclusion paragraph, right? You want to reiterate some of the main points. You want to articulate how things sort of all come together and what your thesis statement is. Again, I think as a common error that I see, far too many papers that just sort of launch in. I'm just going to address these prompts rather than doing the setup of an introduction and then also a nice closing conclusion paragraph, right? So again, for all of the assignments that you do, unless your professor specifies otherwise, I would be thoughtful about making sure that you have at least an introduction and a conclusion to sort of scaffold your work, right? So I think that's just really strong academic writing. So let's see. All right. Then approaching literature, right? So sometimes, at some point, you're going to get an assignment where you're going to be asked to review different journal articles and then talk about them in a synthesized way, right? And so one of the things that's common is that this is often in the form of a lit review, right? So how many folks have done a lit review before? Okay, so there are several hands up. So one of the things that I like to have folks think about is a lit review, in my mind, and especially at the graduate level, is really meant to synthesize how all these different scholars are thinking about their work and how they're writing it up, right? So a good lit review, in my mind, is not like a book report. Sometimes we have been taught, maybe back in elementary school or high school, around how do we read something and then talk about it. It's really sort of more about a summarization, right? So like the book reporting of like, I read this book, it was good, right? Like, and so that's like, that's elementary. That's basic. We don't want to be a pumpkin spice latte person, basic. And so we really want to sort of take it to the next level. No offense to the PSL lovers in the room or online. But we sort of want to go beyond that. And so what I want you to think about when you're working on something where you have to compare and contrast, I want you to sort of read things and try to pull out what are the themes that you're noticing, right? So as you're reading several different articles and you're having to sort of write about them in a grad paper, whether it's a lit review or whether it's an assignment, it's really helpful for you to think about like, well, how are these scholars conversing with one another through their writing, right? So like, how are these ideas similar? What's sort of standing out that's different? And so instead of having like a paragraph which focuses on one article and then you move to the next paragraph and focus on another article, you want to sort of intersperse and interweave ideas from each of these authors back and forth with one another within your paragraphs, because that's actually synthesis, right? It's sort of saying, if so-and-so says that retention is a critical issue in higher education, but we need to be thinking about that at a K-12 focus before, like we need to be helping the pipeline, but other people aren't saying that, well, that's an important piece to put into that. We don't want it to get lost in its own sort of separate sort of statement. So we want to sort of have that through connection and interweave these ideas throughout. One of my teachers liked to say, if you could imagine right, that you are at a dinner conversation with scholars, and that people were having these conversations back and forth and across and like screaming at each other, sometimes polite side conversations. That's sort of the approach that you want to take in your writing. Like, how do these sort of people talk about, this person said this, well, this person agreed with this person, but then they elaborated because their study was slightly different or looked at this aspect of it. And then this scholar actually said just the opposite of both of these, and there's still room to sort of understand what's going on here, right? That's a much more interesting way as a reader to also understand the work, but it also then helps us sort of figure out what's sort of the gap and what are the things that we need to be thinking about in our own work to sort of fill those gaps. Does that make sense? Okay, so again, we're always trying to aim for synthesis rather than summarization, right? Summarization is great, but we want to go beyond, especially at the grad level. Trying to synthesize that can be really helpful. So here's a couple of things that I think are really important in terms of academic writing. The first is write what you mean and mean what you write. Right? So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is I see so many students feeling like they have to be smart and using big words that make no sense to me, right? Like, so the thesaurus tool in Word should not be your friend. I promise you, it's not necessary. Like, actually, if we can talk about things in a way without using big fancy words just for the sake of using big fancy words, that's actually better scholarly writing, I promise you. So it's not necessarily like important to use fancy words or bigger words or words that aren't necessarily commonly used. It's just making sure that you're using them correctly, right? And that becomes critical. The other piece that I want to say really early on, and I know especially for first year grad students, this is a common piece, is that you often open up a textbook. And these are like words that you're like, oh my gosh, like I feel like I'm having to go to Wikipedia and look up every other word because I don't know what this is, right? And so part of this also is the process of understanding that, like, when you first learned to walk, you didn't just jump to walking, right? So this is a new process and language does get different. And by the time you're 7 semesters or 8 semesters from here, this is gonna be stuff that you know, right? And it's gonna be commonplace because you've learned it. So part of it is, yeah, you have to take the extra time and ask the question to yourself, or don't get bent out of shape because you don't know everything. It's okay, neither do I. I go to Wikipedia often before class to make sure that I have it right? So it's what we do, and that's why those tools are available to us. But again, just be thoughtful in making sure that you're using words correctly and that they're in the right context, that it's not also lapsing into informality, right? So the ways that we write a paper should be different than how we might write an email or should be talking to like our best friend, right? So again, just being thoughtful about that. It's also really important to be as concise as possible. And actually the APA manual says that that should be our task, right? So we shouldn't necessarily, here's a great example that I'm now much more conscious about in my writing, right? So I am a person who uses the phrase, the ways in which, right? So the phrase, the ways in which, 4 words. How covers and means the same thing as the ways in which. So if you can use one word to say something that commonly you might say in 4, use the one word, right? So there are those things where sometimes in our writing, it just becomes a part of how we talk or the ways in which we communicate, but there are ways to make it simpler and to just sort of cut it down. So in APA, we're encouraged to do that. And so again, if you're a person who is a little bit more verbose, that's the word, verbose, like me, then I have to do a lot of editing and cutting down, right? You have to sort of, know yourself. If you're a person who already is very concise, just make sure that you're having enough detail that you've fully answered everything. For those of us who start to like write too much, well, then we have to sort of pare down, like what is really important and what's not. Where did we maybe go on a tangent? Take that out, right? So really being thoughtful about all of those pieces. Additionally, we want to try to eliminate as much redundancy as possible. So sometimes in our writing, we think that it's really important to like hit the same thing over and over and over to make our argument. But if we're saying it almost identically, it's not really helping our argument. It only just sort of like, it's like, okay, you already said that. Why are we saying that again, right? So try to avoid redundancy as much as possible. And the last piece of being diplomatic and humble, sometimes what I notice with writers, especially when they want to make a strong argument, they will say with certainty, or like they will say, absolutely, this is definitely happening. Well, we actually don't know that. And actually, one of the things that we often will say is when we're trying to research something, we might say the phrase like, in my review of the literature, no studies actually have looked into this issue. Well, friends, here's the thing. There is something probably out there. We just may not have access to it, or we may not have found it. It may have been that we are coming at this from a very Western approach and that we're only looking at it from the US, but other scholars in other countries have certainly found things around this, but just don't have access to their work. So again, we want to be sort of a little bit more humble. We want to sort of say there may not have been, there may not have found too many articles, or there may be some things out there. Unfortunately, for this particular assignment, I couldn't find any that were easily locatable. So we want to sort of couch and be a little bit diplomatic, because again, there is probably something out there, but we just might not have found it. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, organizing our work, just again, thinking about writing a paper and sort of thinking through, it's really helpful to make sure that each paragraph is one relevant subtopic of your larger argument, right? So when we think about it, we want to make sure that from an organizational standpoint, that each paragraph is unique to themselves about the main point. And what happens sometimes is that we don't sort of break up paragraphs enough. So we have to have at least 2, if not 3, and I would probably say more on the side of 3 sentences for each paragraph, that at minimum, right? But then you don't want to have too long of a paragraph either, because then that can sort of run on and get a little bit muddy for the reader. So you want to break things up so that way, what is the main subpoint that you're trying to make in your larger argument around this, and then build off of to the next. We also want to make sure that you are introducing and doing a nice transition statement to how this paragraph connects to the next paragraph. And sometimes that also is a key thing that a lot of folks forget about, because we want to help the reader understand. And this is sort of going back to the beginning. Sometimes in our heads, we are conscious of how these ideas go together, but if a reader who doesn't have the same familiarity or hasn't read all of these things, if they don't have that consciousness, then sometimes we're asking them to do more work than we are, right? So we want to sort of build a bridge. So at the end of every paragraph, a slight transition to help the reader understand how this section connects with this next section, and even thinking about it from section to section, doing some intros and then going to the next. We want to make sure that we also are using complete sentences, of course, so avoiding fragments, making sure that there is a noun, a verb that we are using, and that it also is an active voice, right? So sometimes, and this is not one of the bullets, when we write, sometimes we will get into writing passive voice, right? So passive voice means that sometimes like the verb is coming at the end of the sentence, or instead of like the noun and the verb are at the end of the sentence rather than at the beginning. And so a test for this is if you add at the end of a sentence, by zombies, right? So like if you write out your sentence and then you read it aloud to yourself and you add at the end, by zombies, if it makes sense, then it's passive voice. So like if you had a sentence like, let's see, in the scholarship on first generation college students, we understand that students often face obstacles based upon parental support. So if we use that sentence and then we add by zombies, it doesn't really work, right? But if we changed it up, and now I'm gonna have to sit and think about how we wanna change it up so it would be passive voice. So parental support is often pointed to by scholars as, no, that's not, still not gonna do it. I should have had an example. Damn. I'll come back to this. I'll think about it. I'll come back to it. I promise. But essentially, when we engage in this, we want to be conscious about trying to avoid passive voice as much as possible, right? We want everything to be sort of more active. And again, this is an APA rule. We want everything to be as much as active voice as possible. We also want to be using appropriate punctuation between sentences, right? So APA style says that at the end of every period, for right now, it needs to be 2 spaces, and then you start the new sentence. What's coming in APA 7 is a reverting back to one space after every period. So this is going to be a change I'm not going to enforce. I don't think most of us are going to enforce, and I don't think most of us sit there with a ruler to make sure to know whether it's 1 space or 2 spaces. But ultimately, just know that in APA 7, the rule after every period is that you have 1 space only, not 2. That's where it's going. So I would say you could probably start doing 1, and it'd be fine. Yeah. Yeah. I would. Well, and so this is the thing, like when I was going through my grad program, it used to be 1, then it moved to APA 6, then it moved to 2, now it's back to 1. And even across like scholars, like there's disagreement about whether it's 1 or 2. So it's not consistent. So that's the fun part of APA too. APA headings are your friends. So again, in the supplemental paper that I had sent and have provided to folks, APA headings, right, are the ones that are centered or left justified, and there are different levels of headings. So when you use a heading in APA, it's also giving a signal to the reader to understand, is this a major theme, or is this a sub-theme of that major theme? Or is that a sub-theme of this sub-theme, right? So it sort of breaks it down. So if you look on page 2, in the center where it says major writing skills, that is a first level heading. It's bold, it's centered, it's capitalized. A second level heading is the next 3 down. So writing skill 1, writing skill 2, writing skill 3. And so that's a second level heading because each of those would be sub-themes of the larger theme of major writing skills, right? If we look even further down the page, though, we have an example of a first level, a second, and a third level heading. So again, understanding APA style is a first level heading. And in that, manuscript structure is it's a second level heading because it's under APA style. And then you'll see, even in the introduction of that paragraph, there are 2 main elements of manuscript structure. The first is document setup, and the second is cover page. And so those are 2 sub-themes that are found under manuscript structure. And so the document setup and the cover page are set up as third level headings. And so you can notice here that third level headings are indented, they're bolded, but only the first letter or the first word. The first letter of the first word is capitalized, and all subsequent are lowercase. Now, the exception that I'll say here is that if you were studying, or if we were doing a paper on a particular identity, or there's something that is included in the subtheme that's a proper noun. So if we were studying Latino students, we would capitalize the L on Latino, even though all of the other words would be lowercase, right? So we would still keep anything that's a proper noun to be capitalized, but all other words would be lowercase. Yes, Gia.
So if you're going to use heading, do you have to have multiple headings?
So yes, I would say that yes, if you are going to use headings, you should have multiple headings that you would be using. But even from like a let's see, for some of you who are working on your 513 classes, right? You have your first like My Life as a College Student or papers, right? You could sort of break it down based upon like certain experiences and just use like first level headings, right? So like organizing it so that way it doesn't have to be drilled down to like a third level heading at this point, but it just will help as an organizer to sort of make sure like, oh, I'm starting to slip right now into like the next section. So I need to like frame out like and break down, and maybe that's a new paragraph or a new section of your paper. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you don't have to have like all the way down to third or fourth level headings at this point, but it can be helpful just to start incorporating some of the major headings at the very least into your assignments. Yeah. Yeah, of course. So I don't, in the sample paper that I provided you, I did not give you anything beyond a third level heading, and that's on purpose because I'm a firm believer that typically we don't need that at the master's level. Like you might, if you're working on a dissertation, have a fourth level heading, but really we don't need to get that serious at this point. Even a master's thesis, I've never had a student have to do more than a third level heading. So just keeping it to those three, I think can be sufficient in terms of using APA headings, okay? The other piece that I want to sort of name is that everything important goes into your introduction and your conclusion, right? So if we think about it, you know, if you imagine who your reader is, and sometimes you know that your reader is your faculty member, but you can't make it, you can't hold that assumption the entire time. You do want to sort of front load what's the important pieces, like, and again, that helps with the hook, right? So like, what is the hook? Now, the other piece that I'm going to suggest too is, and especially thinking about folks who get sort of paralyzed about like wanting to write their paper in order, write the narrative of your paper, then go back and write your introduction, because actually your introduction will be stronger to be written last because you know what you've actually written. So if you take the time to sort of like think about your organization, start with sort of like where your major themes are, then go back and you can write your intro and your conclusion last. It just helps you because you have a better sense of what the overall arguments have been made in your paper to be able to sort of articulate those and outline those. And then again, like there is a piece about say it, never just say that you will say it. So if you in your introduction or in your roadmap, you say, I will talk about this, make sure that you actually talk about it, right? Because if not, then something's missing. So where's that part of your argument? So make sure that if you are articulating that you're going to discuss this, if you're going to highlight this, that make sure that you have spent sufficient time in your paper to make sure that you have actually said what you've outlined that you're going to do, okay? Okay, so word level issues. We're going to go into a few that I think can sometimes be tricky, particularly in scholarly writing at the graduate level. So first is trying to avoid ambiguous references. And so a lot of times we might use the word we or it or this in our writing. And oftentimes those are not clear what we're referring to, or folks are making assumption of who we means, right? So oftentimes we might use we to refer to like other school counselors or other folks who are working in higher education. But that we can't make that assumption. We should not make that assumption. So instead, we would actually want to specify that. So instead of using we, we'd want to specify school counselors or student affairs professionals and be more specific, because that's going to help the reader not feel muddied, right? We also want to watch out for homonyms. So are we going to, or should we be using its apostrophe or its its? There's a difference there. So its means like, it is, right? It's a contraction. It is something that would actually be the possession of, right? Is it affect or effect? Is it extent or extent? Is it principle, like the principle of a school, AL, or is it a principle, a value, a core tenant, right? So being sure that we're also using the right spelling and the right word. And again, I encourage folks, if you're confused or don't know, Google is our best friend, right? And I do this too. Should I use this or that? And I put that into a search engine and I pop up and I'll read on Grammarly or some of these that have like really helpful free resources to know like, okay, like and I would say affect and effect is one of the most common, right? Is it, which one should I be using for this? Is there a cause? Well, then it's EFF, ETC. If it's an effect that I'm having on someone, then that would be AFF, ETC, right? So trying to work through those. Additionally, sometimes folks will use but or however as interchangeable terms, but those mean different things. So we want to be intentional also about, are we using those words correctly? So however is, if you use the word however, then I'm expecting as the reader that the next statement is going to be the complete opposite of what comes before it, right? But using but might mean that there's more to say, right? It's not going to be in direct opposition to what's coming. So again, we want to be careful about how we use those terms. In APA, we also want to try to avoid contractions as much as possible. So we do want to spell out, like if we had in a word or in a sentence, we were using do not, we want it to be written out do not rather than don't. Right? Or we don't want to use isn't, is not. We would want to write out is not. Additionally, we want to be consistent with your verb tense. So when we're talking about literature that's been done in the past or studies that have been done in the past, then we always use past tense. And so we want to be clear about using past tense as much as possible. Additionally, we want to, in the work, we also want to use authors' last names, not their first names, right? So scholars have earned their degrees, and so we want to be good about that. So again, when we cite somebody, go ahead and just use their last names. You don't even have to give first and last names. Again, APA is asking us to be concise, so we don't have to put all of the information. And additionally, we want to be careful about assumptions of gender too. We can't automatically assume based upon a name that we know their gender. And some folks will sometimes say Smith and her colleagues, and then you actually look at the source and, well, Smith is not a woman. So like we need to be careful about that. Or what actually ends up more times than not, we assume that the gender is a man, and that because by they're a scholar, then they are a guy. Well, in fact, eliminating the fact that they are women, right? So again, try to just avoid pronouns as much as possible, because that'll just be helpful. You can just say the author's full last names and list them that way. Not a problem. So a couple of other pieces of additional advice. Author names are key, right? Like we want to respect people's names. So make sure that we spell them correctly, right? And as somebody who has a last name that is easily incorrectly written, I get really bent out of shape when like people will say something that is not my name, right? So that would be something. Question from Jackie, can we use they or their for author pronouns? I think I think it's a safer way to sort of talk about it, but at the same time, I still think that you could probably just not use they or their, and still be sufficient in terms of writing about it. So again, I would still err on the side of just not using pronouns, or you could just say the author or the authors said, and that way you sort of like it's a little bit more neutral. It's a little bit more inclusive. All right. Additionally, going to the next piece. So lots of times, and I still do this, direct quotes is a constant thing of like, should I use a direct quote or should I paraphrase what I'm reading? And here's what I always think about. If I read something from someone's work and they have said it in a way that I could not say better, right, then I will use the direct quote. But I want to make sure that folks, particularly at the grad level, are using direct quotes sparingly. And part of that is, and here's why, okay? So when you write up an assignment, or you write a paper, you write a lit review, and you're using a lot of direct quotes, you start to eliminate your voice as a scholar because you're reliant on other people's work, right? And that can just sometimes feel like you lose your agency as somebody who is a scholar. This is a scholarly process. You're getting a master's degree, and so you are a scholar, as much as sometimes we bristle at that thought, you are becoming a scholar, and you're becoming a scholar practitioner in our case, right? We want you to be able to apply theory to practice. So we want you to paraphrase, and by paraphrasing, that means that you have to think about what somebody wrote, put that through your own mind and your own meaning-making filter, and then put it out there in your own words. And that's much more powerful. It actually is very empowering to think about, like, oh, I had to really think through what this person was saying, and this is how I see it, and this is how I'm understanding their work. So you're actually taking their work and building off of it in terms of your idea. So we want you to try to paraphrase as much as possible while citing that you have gotten this idea or these ideas from the source that you have, right? So that's the importance of in-text citations. But again, if you find that there is a direct quote that you couldn't change in your capability to make better, then use the direct quote. That's fine. But again, just use them sparingly, right? And again, there's also no mention to explicitly naming the paper that you read, the source that you read, the journal that you read. So sometimes, again, it feels a little book reportish when I get a paper that says, well, first of all, this is my biggest pet peeve. So if y'all have me in the semester, just make a note. Webster Dictionary defines X as blank. I was like, no, get it out of there. Like, you don't need to define a term up front for me. That feels very like, like, let's go beyond that, right? Like, let's think about how we sort of think a little bit more critically about this term and bring that up. But again, like, if you don't have to say, like, in their book, College Student Development, or Student Development in College, I forget all of the authors at this point because there are several, but then they said blah, 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 blah. Just go and just cut that first part off and just go into, like, so-and-so said this, right? Again, we're looking for concise. So it doesn't matter what the source that you're finding it from, because we'll actually see that in the reference list. We have that information. We know where it's coming from. We just don't need you to include it in the narrative of the sentence. And then lastly, again, I'm just going to reiterate this point and have my own redundancy for a main point, but you do not have to be scholarly in order to use a thesaurus, right? So your writing just needs to be clean, concise, and well-written. Using fancy words does not equate to being smart, right? I am a person who does not feel like I have the biggest vocabulary, right? I really don't. But I've gained vocabulary over time because I've gone through the academy. But I also think that it's a gift to be able to talk about really complex words and concepts in a way that other people can commonly understand, right? What I hate seeing is convoluted, like, really, like, big terms just for the sake of big terms. Like, that to me is inaccessible, and that goes against what I really am trying to strive for, right? So again, as a writer, I just think all of us should be going to the place of, like, make it concise, make it clear, make it so that other people can understand, right? That becomes really helpful. Okay, any questions at all from folks about these pieces in terms of just general, before we get into some APA stuff? We've started that process, but I just want to go a little bit further. Yeah, Shannon. We are, yes, yep. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of information I'm going to present. For those of you who are taking notes here, I'm also going to send the slides after, so that way, like, if you can take notes, because it might be helpful just to process, but, like, just know that some of this, and I'm going to go over not everything, but you'll have the slides so that way you can refer back to where it might be found in the manual, but I'm only going to sort of go on some of the big things that I think are most important getting started. Okay, cool, we all on board? Okay, great. So when we start a manuscript, right, we need to make sure that everything on all sides, the margins are at 1 inch, right? In Word, by default, oftentimes left and right are set up at 1.25 inches. So you want to make sure that when you go into a Word document and go into your preferences and just change that. So you can just make sure that every single time you open Word, it's just going to set up 1 inch margins all around, top, bottom, left, and right. In APA, it does need to be 12-point font, and it should be Times New Roman. You can use Arial in research when you're creating a table or a figure, but but otherwise it should be Times New Roman. From the beginning, everything should be double spaced. So everything in your paper has to be double spaced. There should be no single spaced entries anywhere on your paper. And I will also note that in Word 2007 default, if you go into paragraph under the format, I think, there's that checkbox of like a line break between similar paragraphs. You want to make sure that that's taken out. You don't want any additional line breaks that are unnecessary. So we don't want like point spacing where like at the end of a paragraph there's like a white space and then we move to a new paragraph. Everything should just be continuous, right? So every line should go. And then additionally, your line justification should always be left justified, right? So when you like look through the sample paper, on the right-hand side, the edges are jagged, right? At the very end on the right-hand side, that's what we want. And sometimes some of us really like the look of the justified where like it goes across and so everything lines up on the left and everything lines up on the right, but APA tells us don't do that. So I'm sorry for those of us who like orderly, like everything to look equal, but that's not how we do this in APA. So make sure it's just left justified. Additionally, when we indent, the beginning of each paragraph needs to be at 1/2 inch. So making sure that you have your tab set up. Sometimes we'll see like 1/4 inch indentations. It needs to be a 1/2 inch or 5 to 7 spaces, but I would just say 1/2 inch from the left, okay? So if we look at the cover page of the sample, we're gonna walk through this. So one of the first things that we need to make sure that we do when we open up a Word document and we're starting a cover page is actually ensure that if we go into the document section of Word, there is an option of clicking a box of different first page. We want the check for different first page because the cover page, up at the top, you'll see running head. So as of right now in APA 6, one of the things that we have to include at the top of our cover page is this phrase, running head, and then an abbreviated topic or abbreviated title of our larger assignment. And this phrase running head : and then the space only appears ever on the front page. This is an old antiquated thing where when you used to like write an assignment or write a manuscript, you would take it to a book publisher, and this would basically be like how they would sort of like know what the title is. It's just continued on. In APA 7, what I'm hearing is that this gets removed. So this might be a change that actually is good for everyone. I'm very supportive of this change. But essentially, you have to have the words running head at the top. You have to make sure that the capital R, but no capital H, right? So it's just, the only thing that's capitalized is R in running. Head needs to be lowercased, and then there needs to be a colon. The other piece here at the top is that your page numbers need to be right on the right hand side, so you can just automatically do the insert page numbers up in the header, and then you can choose making sure that it's at the top right of your page. And again, all of this needs to be in Times New Roman. So one of the things that oftentimes too in default in Word is that it might be set up where your automatic font is Calibri or one of the other fonts. So sometimes your page number, everything else is fine, but your page number shows up in a different font. So just make sure that your page numbers are still Times New Roman and everything up in the header is Times New Roman as well. The other common thing is that some students get confused early on in APA and think that the running head is on the first line of where you type into the document. But in fact, you have to click up in the header and put all of the title information up there. That's where this information for running head and the abbreviated top title and the page numbers, that's where that information goes all on one line. The running head in terms of the abbreviated title also needs to be no more than 50 characters, including punctuation and spaces. So if it's too long, that just gets a little bit messy. So making sure that you're doing that. So again, for this particular sample paper that I've shared with you, that's under 50 characters. I checked. So you can literally like copy, highlight it with your cursor, go into word count, and it'll show you how many characters it is. So you can sort of track that. Again, it does need to be started at the flush left margin, and again, uppercase the R, and then all of the title is uppercased in terms of the running head. And then subsequently, on the following pages, if you check, or if you look at the sample paper, it's just the abbreviated title up on the left margin, all caps, and then again, the page number. So you do need to make sure that when you put in your running head on the first page and you've hit that inward different first page, you have to then go in and make sure that on the second page, you go back in, put your title, your abbreviated title only, page number should go starting at 2, and then it'll automatically populate for all subsequent papers or pages in your paper, right? Okay, any questions about that? Okay, so the rest of your cover page then, you have your running head, you have your page number, and then you have your title, which is centered on the upper half of the page. So my recommendation is that at the top of the page, where you actually can type in naturally, like where your words go, I automatically set mine to double spaced, and then I do 3 hard enter breaks on my keyboard. And that'll bring you down 3 double-spaced lines, and that's where you put in your the title centered. Does that make sense? So again, if we think about like, I'm just gonna stop sharing the PowerPoint for just a second for those of you who are online, and I'm gonna open up the sample paper so that way we can see it up here, right? So if we look at this, the cursor where it's blinking right now is the first line of Word, right? So if I automatically go in and I set up in here on a format and a paragraph, and I make sure that it's double spaced, right? Then if I did enter on my keyboard 3 times, then that's where the title goes, right? Then the next line down is your name. And then the next line down is your institutional affiliation. Now, APA also has a piece in here that says about author notes, contact information, and everything. We don't include that as a part of the cover page for our department. So for no faculty member in our department will say that you have to have an author's note or correspondence information. Don't worry about it, right? You just need to make sure that what's appearing here is there. And if you run into an issue where a faculty member in our program asks you to do more than that, you just let me know and I will follow up with that faculty member, okay? That's the fun part of being department chair. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, after that, then you do want to make sure that you do a hard break. So after California Lutheran University, you would go to the next line, and then you'd want to do insert and then break and do a page break, right? So that way it's a clear break, and automatically it will take you to the second page of your document, okay? From there, right, then you'll want to put in, again, the header information and your page numbers. And what you automatically start with on the top of your next page in line with APA is the title of your paper, but you don't bold it. So this is a distinction that I think some folks get confused about, because this is the title of your paper, not a major heading. So because you've already put your title up ahead, you just unbolded, put your title here, and then make another line break, and then start with your introduction paragraph.
If you have like a extensively long title,
yep.
Do you still do a shorter title?
No, so this would be, yeah, so here and also here on the first page, that's a great question. If you had a title which had like, you know, let's say for my life as a college student, you have like a fancy cool title, and then it's colon, my life as a college student assignment, right? You would put that whole title here on the cover page. So it might go over 2 lines. You might do that. And then again, here on the top of the second page, you'd use your full title again. Yep, so everything would match up that way. That's a great question. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing again and go back to sharing our PowerPoint and continue from there. So that is sort of the basics of a cover page. And again, for those of you getting started, that's going to be one of the things that consistently we are expecting on every single assignment within the program, right? Every single assignment that you submit to an instructor needs to have a cover page, unless it's like your 581 journal and your professor has said you don't have to submit something that's like APA formatted in that way, right? Additionally, I want to sort of go back to, we talked about direct quotes or paraphrasing earlier, and I want to make sure, because this is really important, particularly right from the start, we want to make sure that if it is not our original idea, that we are giving it a citation to and a nod to where we got that source material from, right? So a direct quote, we absolutely have to include either the page or the paragraph number where that source is or where that quote comes from. And in a paraphrasing material, we want to make sure that we also include an in-text citation, not necessarily that there's a page number attached or a paragraph number attached, but we want to make sure that it's that we reference what source it's from, right? So again, if we type out a sentence and there's anything in that sentence that's not our original idea, then we need an in-text citation at the end. So like before we put in our in-text citation, we need to make sure that we are referring to that. Now that can feel a little bit like you're doing a lot of like citations, and that's okay. I'd rather folks get into the practice of like doing more citations than they need rather than doing too few, because again, if we don't include a reference for a direct quote or a paraphrase material, then we are engaging in plagiarism, right? And we don't want that to be the case. So again, we want to make sure that we are clear about doing as much citation as possible to reference where we're getting our cites from, okay? So we've talked about headings. I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to also skip over some of this. So to just sort of go to some of the things that I think are a little bit more important. Spelling is outlined in here that essentially we're supposed to be using the first spellings of words. So for example, Merriam-Webster as a dictionary, there you can use canceled can show up and be appropriate with 1 or 2 L's, right? So we're supposed to use the first spelling. I don't necessarily go through and check that as closely because again, sometimes I get confused about these things. So I don't think that most of your professors are going to do that. But again, I would just make sure, like, just check. Like sometimes if it doesn't come up in spell check, then probably it's fine, right? Abbreviations though, there are some specifics. So for example, if we're providing a time, then yes, we would use AM or PM. But in APA, we want to make sure that it's AM with periods after the A and the M, not just like squished together AM with no periods. So just keep that in mind. Additionally, there are other pieces around some rules about like, for example, or e.g. or i.e., etc. So we only use that in parenthetical material. So if it's actually, you're writing it out, we would never use etc., etc. period in a sentence. It would only be something like if we were to add on in a parentheses with an explanation of it. Does that make sense? So we want to make sure that we try to use that sparingly as much as possible. So seriation is one thing that shows up. And so again, I want to have folks take a look at the bottom of page 2 of the sample paper that I provided. And this is, seriation is just like when you have a list or bullets, right? And there are different rules for this. So in some ways, if APA says that if you have a list that isn't hierarchical, you can use a bulleted format. So you can have a bullet point and sort of have them listed to sort of show like the organization. And that's completely fine. For elements within a paragraph or a sentence, identify each by lowercase letters in parentheses. So in this particular example, 3 choices were A, option 1, B, option 2, C, option 3. So there's not a hierarchy there, but you do need to use lowercase a, b, c to represent the organization. And it does need to be closed within parentheses. So you need to use parenthesis A, lowercase a, and then the end parenthesis. If there are internal commas, you would use semicolons at the end. So 3 choices were A, red, green, and blue, semicolon, B, black and white, or semicolon, or C, pink. So again, on the sample, I sort of break it up. Like in this section, I will highlight the 2 main elements, A, the document setup, and B, the cover page. Just pulling those pieces out then helps the reader understand that there are 2 ideas that are being presented and that you're sort of demonstrating and highlighting some of that a little bit more directly. Does that make sense for folks? You can, again, though, you can, so we want to avoid putting 1, 2, and 3 because APA is saying that we shouldn't be using numericals. It should only be letters. That's an APA rule. It's not a me rule, so don't blame me. I'm just the messenger, okay? So numbers. This is another thing that sort of gets sometimes mistaken. So if we are referring to numbers, we use figures to express numbers 10 and above. So if we're saying the number 11, we would actually write 1, 1, right? If we were to say 4 students, we would actually need to write out FOUR students, right? So if it's 1 through 9, we actually do need to write out the word. If it's 10 or more, we would use the numerical figure for that number. We use figures under 10 if being compared to numbers over 10. So if you were using this example of 3 of 21 children, we actually would use the numerical 3 in that case because there's a comparison. So there are some exemptions to this as well. But in the following example, but 15 traits of each of 4 checklists, there's nothing being compared there. So that's why 15 is being used as a numerical, but 4 would be written out because there's no comparison between the 15 and the 4, okay? So this is where APA gets tricky because there's really intricate rules around this. The one thing that I would say for those of you who are entering as new students, and because we're telling you like we're waiting until the new edition comes out, the biggest rule that I would just say is that no one's gonna deduct you as long as you write from 1 to 9, like write it out as a word, and 10 plus as a figure, right? The comparison piece, we're not gonna dock any points for any of that. Like I would just for right now, basically just plan on writing numericals that way until we know what 7th edition APA rules are gonna come forward, okay? So additionally, using a number that represents time, dates, ages, scores, points on a scale, exact sums of money, etc., plays out slightly differently. So if you were talking about 2 weeks ago, you actually would use the numerical 2. If you were talking about it took 1 hour and 34 minutes, you would write it numerically. If you're talking about an age, it is a numerical. And if you scored 4 on a 7-point scale, those would be numerical rather than written out words. But you would use words for approximation of the number of days. So if you're talking about 3 months ago, you would need to write out 3 rather than use the numerical, right? This is where people are like, this is frustrating because I don't know, right? And I get it, but part of it is about like sort of just, these are the intricacies of sort of thinking about it. So again, if you're writing something about time, dates, ages, scores, just remember that is a numerical figure. So percents is the next one. Sorry. No, that's good. But you're getting me ready.
So see that I have to write about 11 months.
Yep. So about 11 months ago, then you would be writing it in numerical form. Yes. So yeah. So that's true. Yes. Okay, so here's the example that Shaylee's asking about in terms of percentages, right? So we would use a word to begin the sentence. So if we said 48%, we would write out 48% of the sample. But if we were doing words with common fractions, that's written out. Words for universally accepted usage, then we write those out. So 5 pillars of Islam, the 12 apostles, those are written out. So if we were to do like percentages, not starting at the beginning though, you would not necessarily write it out numerically, right? But it's only if you start with it at the beginning of a sentence, percent. So if you could say the reverse would be in the sample 48%, it would be numerically 48% said X, Y, and Z. Yeah.
So if you begin the sentence with 48,
then you write it out. Yes.
If it's in the middle.
Then it's numerically.
Even if it's like 5%.
Even if it's 5%. Yep. Okay. So now we're getting into citing references in the text. So, so in terms of this, these are 2 examples, right? So when we, references in APA publications are cited in text with an author date citation system and are listed alphabetically in the reference list, right? So when we go to the reference list, instead of where it just appears in the paper, it needs to be alphabetical by author's last name, by first author's last name, right? So we'll get to the reference list in a little bit. But this statement right here, left-handers make up 8% to 13% of most human populations, with left-handedness more common in men than in women. So Gilbert and Wysocki in 1992, they named this research, and McManus found in 1991 found the same work, right? They're not giving a direct quote here. This is a paraphrase, but both researchers, or both sets of researchers, found similar information. And so this is a paraphrased sort of understanding of this data. And so how we show it here is that it is alphabetical, right? So Gilbert and Wysocki, even though it came out in 1992, because Gilbert is the first author, they're listed first, and then McManus, because of M, gets listed second. Does that make sense? Okay. So when we cite references in text, typically we would name, when we start off the sentence, we could write Kessler in 2003 in parentheses, found that ... right? Or we might have our sentence and we just write it and we're paraphrasing it. And then we are citing at the end, Kessler, 2003, end paragraph, then period. Because ultimately, one of the things that I like to have folks think about is if each of your sentences starts with a scholar and then the year of publication, you're really centering the scholar rather than their ideas. So it can be helpful to have a mixture of like starting with some sentences with the scholar's name and then also having that information at the end. So again, just thinking about that. You could also do the third bullet down. In 2003, Kessler's study of ... And so you automatically know the year of publication at the start of that sentence, and you wouldn't then need to have that either in an in-text citation after Kessler's name or at the end of the sentence, right? That would be redundant. For 2 authors, you have to cite both names every single time that the reference occurs, right? So if we said that Kessler and Smith, we would have to use Kessler and Smith throughout. We couldn't just drop Smith, because Smith wrote the thing, so we need to give proper credit, right? Now, that changes though, if we have 3, 4, or 5 authors of a piece. And in that case, we cite the first author, we cite all authors the first time, and then after that, we would just use Kessler et al. So we'll use this same like citation here. So it would be, and I'm gonna like actually put it in here. So that after it would be Kessler et al. 2003 as just an example for folks, right? Yeah.
When you first do all of the authors, you use the ampersand.
That's correct. So the ampersand only shows up if it's in the in-text citation. So if we were to pull, like, I'm going to point folks to the top of page 2 of the sample paper that hopefully you have. The first sentence there, Evans, Forney, Guido, Patton, and Wren, right? The ampersand, the and sign, is used because it's in the in-text citation. But if we moved that sentence around and we said at the very beginning, in not parentheses, Evans, Forney, Guido, Patton, and Wren, it would need to be written out and. And then in that case, then we would have a parentheses, 2010, end parentheses, and then a comma for many students in grad school, blah, 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 right? We would continue on with that statement. For 6 or more authors, and again, this is somewhat rare in higher ed, I'll say, we cite the first author, then et al. For every single mention. So in some cases, if we have 6 or more authors, every single time we put down, it would just be the first author's last name, et al. The other piece that I want to make sure that folks are really, really clear about is that the punctuation here on et al. Okay, and this is like one of the most common errors that I see. Sometimes what I will see is that the period shows up after et and after all. Sometimes it's only on et and not all, but it's essentially the punctuation here is correct. So it needs to be et space al period and then comma, okay? And again, if you do have access to the APA 6th edition manual, page 177 gives more citation sort of examples. There are some exceptions, though, in terms of how we document in terms of references, right? So let's say that you were doing an interview, which is common. You would need to sort of give a reference to where you got that from. So like E. Robbins, comma, personal communication, comma, and then the date of the interview. That would be something that you would have. But this does not show up in a reference list. So if you do an interview, you don't include that information in a reference list. Janessa, you had your hand up, I saw.
So this might be like, but like, is there a comma after, or a space after every comma, and then parentheses just enclose whatever?
Yes.
No spaces in between those.
Yeah, so if we go back to this example, is this like one you're talking about, or?
Well, yes.
Or even, yeah, so like there would be a space after every comma, yes. And even if we look back to like the Evans, Forney, Guido, Patton, and Wren one at the top of page 2, you would want to have a space after every comma, yeah. Okay. So reference lists, I'm going to go through, and I've chosen ones that are most common. I think we're going to still get on time, I promise. Okay. Oh, Shannon. Yeah. No, that's okay. Yes.
If, like, you're reading one of the texts and they have an in-text citation, how do you cite, like, the one you're reading or the original?
Okay, so okay, so Chaley's raised a interesting situation. I'm gonna stop share of the PowerPoint and then bring up just a Word document for just a moment. Okay, so let's say that we have found in like the Lifespan Human Development textbook by Sant Rock, or the College Student Development Theory textbook, right? Whichever class you might be in for that class. They're commenting, they're like pulling from a lot of research from a lot of other people. So they are citing their work, right? So let's say that, so they're talking about Kessler 2002 found that 85% of students struggled with math, right? So now this is coming from the St. Rock book, which was published in, let's say, 2016, right? So number one, we try to avoid using secondary sources as much as possible to cite in our work, right? So that's the one thing. Now, that's also get really complicated when we're also trying to cite from a textbook, because that's also like early on what we're often doing, right? So what we would do is say Kessler, if we were, yeah, Kessler, let's see, Kessler 2002, this is a short sentence, so now I have to like figure out how to recraft it in a way that's not plagiarism. That's the fun part, friends. Put on the spot. Kessler's, yeah, okay, I found it. I figured it out. Kessler's research on student experience with math showed that 85% of students experience challenges, right? As cited in St. Roch, 2016. That would be how you would want to acknowledge that you're pulling information that somebody else cited from a source that you're using in your class. So the as cited in St. Roch, or if it was the Patent et al. 2018, like that book, right?
Would you then put Kessler or Patent in your reference?
Yeah, so at that point, you would put in the reference list, you would need to put Patent et al.'s work. Yeah, because you're pulling it from that. Okay, I'm gonna stop share and go back to PowerPoint. Okay, so again, I'm gonna try to quickly fly through this. So if you flip to the last page of the sample paper, I'm just gonna point to some of these that we're gonna go through, okay? So for a book, you're gonna list author's last name and then their first initial, period, space, middle name if they have one, period, or middle initial, period, space, and then the year of publication, then a period, then you're going to do spaces, and then in italics, you're going to put the title of their work, the first word, and again, proper nouns are capitalized only, and then you put a period, a couple spaces, and then the year or the location, so it needs to be the city, and then the state abbreviation, and then a colon, and then a space, and then the publisher of the book. So you would find this on like if you flip open to your book, usually on page 2, here at the bottom, you would find like where the location is that it was published, right? So you're pulling information from this area in order to fill in. So for example, here on the top, the second one down, in the sample, this is a book. So student development in college, this is the second edition. So I've also added in, like sometimes you have to put in the edition that it is. So this is how you would need to format that. And then again, the year or the years after the authors. And again, you're following what's on the book cover, not putting them in alphabetical order based upon what their last names are. Chaley.
After the year,
yep.
Everything then gets 2 spaces before it.
So, that's
like on the thing after the 2000, it looks like engaging in trash is 2 spaces before it. But everything else, like before that part, looks simple.
So that's yes. I did it probably wrong. So after an initial, it's only 1 space. But if you were like moving it, so I think this is going to be the thing that gets tricky with 7th edition and 6th edition. So I think it's actually 1 space. So I think just go to 1 space after every period, not do 2. Okay, that would be my suggestion. I'll maybe also change that and send out a revision in the sample paper. Okay. So if it's a chapter of a book, this is going to be important for you to know. So like some of your textbooks, you will see like at the top of that chapter, it'll say like who the authors are. And if that's the case, that's your signal to know that somebody besides the editors of the book have written this chapter. And so you're going to need to format it based upon being a book chapter, not a book itself, right? So at that point, you're going to use this formula to basically put in the author's names, the year of publication, the title of their chapter, which is not italicized, and then who the editors of the book are, and that gets reversed. So like now it's like their first and middle name initials come first and then their last name, unlike the other, right? And then it has editors in parentheses, and then in italics, it's the title of the book. And then the edition, there is multiple editions, with a semicolon, and then the page range of what that chapter is in their book, right? So you have to look and see what's the first page, what's the last page of this chapter, put that in, and then it's similar. The rest of it is similar to the one we talked about before. So location of the publisher, and then the publishing company. Okay, so for this one, if we look at the sample paper, this is the fourth one down. So Wren and Patton's Campus Ecology and Environments, that's this formatted, is coming from a chapter in a book, okay? A journal article is formatted here. This is an article that I wrote, and this is the fifth citation that's in the reference list on the sample paper. But again, you would put the author's last name, comma, first initial, year of publication, period, and then the title of their article is all it's not italicized. You only capitalize the first word, and then all others are lowercase unless it's a direct or a proper noun. And then the title of the journal is uppercase and lowercase, and it's italicized. You also need to make sure like the volume, or no, the issue number is like, so for here in my example, it's 52. So that means like there is issues and then volumes. So every year there's a new issue. So the issue number climbs every year typically with a journal. And then if they publish their journal, like let's say 4 times a year, it may be that it's issue 52, volume 1, or it may be issue 52, volume 2, and then so on and so forth. So that way the fourth publishing is number 4, right? So then your page range of the article, and then a DOI. A DOI, I'm just gonna go to the next, is a way to find the article online. So if you go to the webpage crossref.org and you copied and pasted the name of my article and my name and the journal, it would pop up to show what the DOI is. So basically, a DOI is basically like a web link to find that specific source. But not all journal articles have a DOI. And so if that's the case, then you do want to be, the only thing that really changes here is the issue and the volume number. So you do need to signify, if you don't have a DOI, what the issue number is. So this 57 with the parentheses, the 4 in parentheses, that is not italicized, whereas the 57 is. But that is giving the signal of which specific volume of that issue of the journal it is that this article is coming from.
So 4 is the one.
4 is the volume, yes.
With when you paste in the DOI, would it remain hyperlinked?
If you pull it back from that page, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, I mean, when you put it in, is it all like?
Yes, it may pop up that way, but most likely, I think if in a DOI, I haven't looked at it in a while, I think it'll just pop up where it won't be like a hyperlink. I think if you copy and paste it in, it shouldn't do it, but if it does, then you will want to take the hyperlink out. Yeah, so. Okay, so we are right at time, but I just have 2 final things to just sort of put in here. There may be an assignment where you will be asked to have appendices, right? So you might have to have like maybe Like for example, when everybody gets to group class, you might have a project where you have to include like PowerPoints that you'd use to run your group as an appendix, right? So the appendix comes after your references. So your reference list would come, and then at the end of your reference list, you'd do a hard break, and then you'd start any appendices that you'd have. So you'd add those pieces in. And at the top of the page, you just write Appendix A, and then insert the first thing. And then for the second, you'd move and have the top right Appendix B. So you just sort of have that. There are extra resources and ones that I think are really reputable and helpful. There's OWL at Purdue with a very helpful web base of breaking down more of the information that is here for APA. And additionally on YouTube, there's a resource for formatting that I've linked as well. And so again, I'll send you these slides. You can bookmark these and use them, but hopefully this has been a helpful overview and gets you at least a little bit farther along in terms of academic writing and APA. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, online folks. We appreciate you being here. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank
you, Dr.
you.
T.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.